Hello and welcome to the tutorial on all enchanting books in Minecraft. The times for each book are on the screen now. First off, we got Aqua Infinity. This increases someone's mining speed underwater. Its max tier is 1 and it can only be used on helmets. So now we're on to Bane of Arthropods. This increases damage and applies slowness to spiders, silverfish, endermites and bees. It has a max tier of 5. It can be used with a sword or an axe, and you cannot use it with Smite or Sharpness. So now we're on to Blast Protection. This reduces explosion damage and knockback. Max tier is 4. It can be used on any type of armor, and it cannot be used with fire protection or projectile protection. So now for channeling. This can shoot lightning bolts at opponents, but only during thunderstorms. It has a max tier of 1, and you can only put it on a trident. And if you have this on a trident, you can't have Riptide on it. Now for Curse of Binding. If you have this on an item, you can only get rid of it if you die or breaks. It is impossible to get off, and it has a max tier of 1. So now on to Curse of Vanishing. If you have this on an item, it will get destroyed when you die. It has a max tier of 1. Now on to Depth Strider. It increases speed when in water. It has a max tier of 3. You can only use it on boots, and if you have them on your boots, then you can't have Frostwalker. Now we're on to Efficiency. This increases mining speed on all types of materials. It has a max tier of 5, and it can be used on all types of tools. Now we're on to Feather Falling. This reduces fall damage. It has a max tier of 4, and it can be used on boots. So now we're on to Fire Aspect. This sets your opponents on fire. It has a max tier of 2, but it can only be used on swords. So now for Fire Protection. This reduces fire damage and burn time. It has a max tier of 4. It can be used with all armor, but it cannot be used with Blast Protection or Projectile Protection. So now we are on to Flame. This sets your arrows on fire. It has a max tier of 1 and can only be used on a bow. So now we're on to Fortune. It increases drops from certain blocks. Has a max tier of 3. It can be used with any type of tool but sword, and you can't have Silk Touch on it. So now for a Frostwalker. This turns water into ice when stepped on. Has a max tier of 2. It can only be used on boots, and if you have it on your boots, you can't have Depth Strider on it. So now we're on to Impaling. This deals more damage to players or mobs. It has a max tier of 5, and it can only be used on a trident. So now we're on to Infinity. This shoots arrows but does not consume them. Has a max tier of 1. It can only be used on bows, and you cannot have a Mending on that bow. So now for Knockback. This increases knockback to players and mobs. Has a max tier of 2, and you can only use it on a sword. So now for Looting. This increases all mob drops. It has a max tier of 3 and can only be used on swords. So now for Loyalty. What this does is after throwing a trident, it returns to you. It has a max tier of 3, and it can only be used on tridents. So now for Luck of the Sea. This increases the rate of good drops like leather, tripbooks and enchanting books. It has a max tier of 3. It can only be used on fishing rods. Now for Lure. This decreases wait time while fishing. It has a max tier of 3. It can only be used with fishing rods. So now for Mending. This repairs items with XP orbs. has a max tier of 1, cannot be used with Infinity, but it can have it on all tools and armor. Now for Multishot. This shoots 3 arrows at once but only consumes 1. It has a max tier of 1. You can't have piercing on it, and it's only used with crossbows. So now for piercing. This has your arrows pass through multiple enemies. It has a max tier of 4. You can't use it with Multishot, and it's only used on crossbows. So now for power. This increases your arrow damage. It has a max tier of 5, and you can only use it on bows. So now for Projectile Protection. This reduces damage from projectiles. It has a max tier of 4. It can be used on all armor, but you can't have blast protection, fire protection, or protection on that armor. So now for protection. This reduces most types of damage by 4% per level. It has a max tier of 4. It's used on all types of armor, and you can't have blast protection, fire protection, or projectile protection on that armor. So now we're on to punch. It increases arrow knockback. It has a max tier of 2, and it can only be used on bows. Now we're on to quick charge. This decreases crossbow charging time. It has a max tier of 3, and it can only be used on crossbows. So now for Respiration. This extends underwater breathing time. It has a max tier of 3, and it can only be used on helmets. So now for Riptide. When throwing a trident, it launches the player with it into the sky. It has a max tier of 3, and you can't use this with channeling or loyalty, but it can only be used on a trident. So now for Sharpness. This increases damage to all mobs and players. It has a max tier of 5. It can be used with axes and swords, and you can't have Smite or Bane of Arthropods on that sword. So now for Silk Touch. This allows mind blocks to drop themselves. It has a max tier of 1, and it can be used with all tools plus shears, and you can't have fortune on that pickaxe. So now for Smite. This increases damage to undead mobs. It has a max tier of 5. Can be only used with swords and axes, and you can't have Bane of Arthropods or Sharpness. So now for Soul Speed. It increases walking speed on soul sand and soul soil. It has a max tier of 3, and it can only be used on boots. So now for Thorns. It reflects a portion of the damage back at the attacker. Its max tier is 3, and it can be used on all armor. So now for Unbreaking. It increases item durability. It has a max tier of 3. It can be used on every item.